So welcome. Thank you for coming. This topic is kind of a passionate topic for me right now. I'm a consultant. I came out of higher ed. I started my own business about 25 years ago. And I have been working in organizations for all of my career around change and transformation. And so this is kind of beginning to be more and more of a culmination of the deep wisdom that you learn over time about organizations and design, and also helping us to see how the way we think about our organizations needs to continue to evolve as our organizations evolve and the time that we practice evolves. So this is the benefit of my current thinking. I'm currently working with 2 or 3 organizations who are trying to intentionally be designed and led from a more resilient framework as opposed to fragile, which I'll talk more about that. So definition of resilience. So here we are. So resilience and resilient science is all about how you design and lead an organization so it can absorb disruption and still maintain function. Have you noticed the number of disruptions that are happening organizationally? And actually, we've been in a 5-year, kind of since COVID really, of massive multiple disruptions. And so it seems like the idea of resilient organization is a time who's come. And yet, many of the things that I've learned over the course of my career has actually, through this lens of resilience, increased the fragility of the organizations I'm working with instead of increasing the resilience. So I think many of us, know how to design organizations in a traditional way. And this doesn't negate those ideas that we've learned, but it does expand it. And so I'll talk more about that. So I've been juxtaposing resilience with fragility, and more recently with the idea of brittleness. So fragile systems are things that in the design don't stand up well with disruption. So they are fragile by design, and then when anything happens, it throws everything up in the air, and they got to redo everything, and they move off mission and purpose as a result, because their attention gets attracted to other stuff. Brittle systems are also kind of antithetical to resilience, but brittle systems look different. They basically are designed in a way and led in a way, more led than designed, in a way that makes them harder and more rigid. And so when they are asked to adapt, they basically collapse, and they look really strong right before they collapse. So it's a slightly different thing, but they're basic, brittle or fragile, same thing. So the first 5 or 6 slides are really about making the case for community foundations to start thinking in this more resilient framework. And then I'm going to stop for questions, a few little questions, and then I'm going to talk about what are the characteristics that make you more resilient. And then if you're a board member like I am for community giving, what does that change for the way you think as governance? And then if you're a staff member, how does it change the way we do our operational day-to-day leadership of our organization? So community foundations, I believe, this is like a mandate that we have because we are uniquely positioned to pay attention and want to pay attention to resilience. We have the opportunity, because of the way we're structured, to want to be relevant and thriving for our communities 100 years from now. And it's how we're designed and structured to do that. So we are place-based, and that means we're anchored in the communities that we serve. We build assets and resources so that we can invest in the communities in the future. And if we build unrestricted endowment, that can be decades, 100 years into the future that we're giving back to our community to make our community stronger. And we have the other mandate, which is to make a community have a positive community impact. So those are reasons why I think community foundations are uniquely positioned and also maybe uniquely obligated to think in this way. We already have a relationship to resilience, but we might not have named it. So any of us who are paying attention to our investments know that there are going to be certain characteristics that we want to make our investments and our assets in our community foundations resilient over time, to be able to have disruption in their finances, but still be viable and not have all of our resources disappear because we've put all of our eggs in one basket or something like that. So this is really all about fulfilling these two promises. So purpose, so I wrote this book called Leading from the Roots, which was looking at what nature could teach us about organizations and, organizational design. Nature is the longest running regenerative system we have to learn from. It's been around for 4.2 billion years, so there's a little bit of R&D in that, and knowledge and wisdom in that system and the way it's designed. So it would seem to me that it's a good place to learn. But one of the things that nature has helped me see is that nature is organized and held together by two things. One is it has a very clear purpose. So if nature were to have a purpose, it would be to create conditions conducive to the life of future generations. Not unlike community foundations, actually, that we want to create conditions conducive to the future generations who will live in our place and who we hope to pass on the very best of our place to future generations, right? That's the purpose. So purpose is always found between the organization and the larger community that it is working in. So what is the deep need in the community that the community foundation is uniquely positioned to meet? And when you find that base, that's where your deep purpose is. It's different from a mission. It's different from a vision. It's different from a set of values. And then what nature does is it unleashes self-organization that organize around that purpose. And then all of a sudden, amazing things happen. It continues to regenerate. So the thing about purpose is that many of our boards see the purpose of the board is to achieve mission. But boards also have an internal purpose that is about the organization and how the organization gets stronger and better. And so we don't often think about this, and leadership teams don't either. They think their job is to deliver on mission, but they also have an internal purpose in the organization. So you have to find your purpose. When I was working at St. Ben's, I was a VP and on the cabinet there, and one of our internal purposes that we agreed to was to fiercely defend the future of our institutions so future generations of students could come and experience the best of what we were trying to be. But what is yours? So this regenerative, resilient design is really about that internal purpose, in addition to what you're trying to do in your community and what you're trying to do elsewhere. So we have these traditional and untraditional frameworks of leadership. And I'm going to, because I'm a board member of Community Giving, I'm going to also kind of layer this up, because resilient systems always scale. So what you're paying attention to inside your organization also has a scaled version that rises up into a governance frame. So these are traditional, in hierarchies, traditional kinds of outcomes that we have, or things that we pay attention to. You know, do we worry about controlling the variables of the system to produce, to hold accountable, to organize, to facilitate, to ensure direction, to be efficient, defend the mission and values? These are all fairly traditional frames. Not a bad thing. But I want to unpack this metaphor. So those of us who live in rural communities will often find ourselves driving along a dark road, two-lane road at night, and we will have the lights of an oncoming car come at us. And we know that if we want to remain safe, we don't drive to the lights. We drive to the right of the lights, into the darkness. And so this seen and unseen kind of aspect, we've been taught to see certain things and govern from a certain set of seen variables. And the resilience frame invites us into the darkness that we drive into to be safe. And the metaphor here is that the safety of driving to the right of the car, not into the lights, but into the darkness, is actually this underlying design framework of resilience. So we're basically in a both and, where we're still bringing our traditional training and understanding of organizations. Many of our organizations are still very hierarchically held, but it's a difference about whether you hold your hierarchy tightly. Think about the energy in a tightly wrapped fist, or lightly, where you're still providing order and facilitation and structure, but also allowing for other ways of thinking and behaving. So that's my case for why it matters. Any thoughts or questions?
Question. In your work with other organizations, these two bullet points, the both and, needing to function as a traditional team, how easy is it then to continue to do that while the team is trying to deepen relationships?
So the ones that I am working with, so I'm working with an international development organization in Africa. Their goal is to transform 10 million small farm holders' lives, both economically and with more resilient regenerative farming techniques. And they realized that they had to change their whole leadership framework inside the organization to actually do that work. And one of the ways they shifted was to shift to locally led sustainable farming. And so what we've found in the 5-year journey that we've been on is that sometimes it's very small tweaks, and sometimes it's fundamentally changing the way you think. And so you can be in both and. I think I've straddled the both and for as long as I've been around doing this work. And sometimes it's very small. So another organization who has intentionally wanted, it's an airport commission, and they have intentionally wanted to be a thriving enterprise 100 years from now. That idea, that vision is held by key people on their current leadership team. For them, it's been small shifts in thinking. For example, when they do budgets, they just don't do expenses and revenue. They also talk about investments. So they ask, what do we need to invest to make a stronger institution, organization 100 years from now? And so sometimes it doesn't make sense in the annual budgeting process to invest more in runways that last 40 years instead of 20 years. But for them, because they're thinking 100 years down the line, it's a worthy investment that they can take off the plate from the next generation of leaders. And so they think of their leadership in this organization as being part of a leadership relay race. So they're holding the baton right now, and they're going to pass on the baton to the next generation of leaders for their organization. And they want to give them, with that baton, less problems than they inherited from the last one. And so they're very actively extending the time horizon so they see how what they inherited as their agenda of problems in the present were affected by decisions that happened before them, and how their decisions in the present will change the agenda of problems in the future. And if they can be more conscious, they can create a lighter load for the next generation when they pass that baton. But what does that look like if you're on a board of a community foundation? Are you thinking about a 100-year time span for your community foundation? Or are you thinking 1, 3, or maybe 5 years ahead? And so sometimes it's small stuff, and sometimes it's a fundamental shift in how you think. Okay. So I'm going to just kind of go through these. So I like to think of the world in systems. And resilient systems and resilient science has lots of different angles to it. And so I'm not going to get into all of that. But these 7 characteristics of resilient systems, to me, seem but like really good practical ways of places where we could start in the way we think about leadership and organizations. And I'll go through these deeper, but basically resilient systems tend to have these characteristics going. So I'm just going to go right off the top here. So the first one is actually about strengthening diversity and redundancy. And in resilient systems, these two things go together. They are not separate. But many of us, myself included, have been attracted by the idea of efficiency as somehow or other a means of assessing the health of our organization. But nature and resilient systems would suggest that every system requires certain critical redundancies in order to function. And if we're not asking the question, what are our critical redundancies that we have to protect, then we're in trouble and we're becoming more fragile than more resilient. So we have 2 nostrils and a mouth to get air into our bodies. If one drops, one doesn't work, the other one might, hopefully, because if we don't get air, we die. That's a critical redundancy. Landing gear in planes, critical redundancy. There are at least 3 systems in an airplane on how do you get the landing gear down so you can get down safely. 3. So, and the last one's manual, right? So if your software fails, there's another software backup, and if that fails, you can crank it down. I was talking to a pilot who was coming up to Minnesota for Delta to train to become a captain of a kind of promotion for him. It's a month-long training. And we were sitting in Atlanta, and we were talking about redundancy. He said, oh, planes have redundancy all over the place because the risk, the catastrophic risk, is such that if you don't have redundancy, you'd all die, right? So I have worked with organizations, and I've rarely sat in a leadership meeting and listened to them talk about or name their critical redundancies that they have to protect. So I want to pose that question for you to be something that you ponder, because sometimes really good questions help us, kind of struggle and work through an issue. So critical redundancy. This whole framework of efficiency for me, through the lens of resilience, has raised some red flags. So I've been thinking about, well, what other things are not very efficient but absolutely necessary for our times? Creativity is never efficient. I don't know if you've noticed that creativity and innovation isn't an efficient process, but there's all kinds of detours and redundancies and reiterations and things like that. So this attraction, because I've felt it myself, to efficiency is really good for simple organizations, maybe somewhat good for complicated organizations, but probably aren't good for complex organizations. So we need to kind of think about, when is efficiency appropriate, and when is efficiency something we want to seek and aspire to, and when does it actually make us more fragile or more brittle than more resilient? So from a governance framework or from a staff leadership framework, you might ask things like, how do we create a culture that creates or is conducive to what I call institutional diversity? But I think the new word that I would probably substitute for institutional diversity is deep diversity. I think our current diversity framework is much more surface, because it tends to be looking at surface characteristics of how we're the same or different. But deep diversity in nature is essential for the ongoing regenerative nature of the organization. For example, food webs are much more resilient than food chains. A single food chain, if something in the middle gets extinct, everything above it dies off, right? Food webs mean that if this species dies off, there's other ways. But in business, it's supply lines. You know, we knew in COVID, for example, that we had a lot of single supply chains, and when the Suez Canal kind of got, oh, thank you, clogged, all of a sudden, our whole supply chain in the world, or much of our supply chain in the world, basically demonstrated its fragility in the system. So how do we think about this? How do we think about community diversity? In community foundations, our business model is actually built in part on our diversity in community. So for example, if we're building unrestricted endowment, we have an annual fund. We want to have as many participants contributing to that fund and seeing the value and the importance of your community foundation in its contribution to the community as possible. So if we have this deeper community, we are in relationship with the whole community, not just a part of the community. And as a result of that, we draw more and more people into supporting the work that will help the future community thrive. And if we only see the community as a part rather than a whole, what we miss just in the institutional diversity is that if you have no diversity and you're building your product line for the future, you won't see needs that actually exist and could be business opportunities, because you don't have people who see those needs sitting around your table thinking about what your potential product line in the future is. But we have a community foundation version of that. If we're not talking to our youth, for example, they are totally off our radar when we think about community needs. So that's why I'm thinking this is about a deep diversity. It's positional. It's where you exist, where you sit in the community, who you're connected to, who you're not connected to, et cetera, et cetera. Bench strength, which is kind of a succession framework. In redundancy, it's like who holds the critical relationships for the community foundation in relationship to the community? Is it one person? If that person retires and takes their relationships with them, is that critical redundancy that you've met, or is that making you more fragile? So we have these kinds of relationships, the friend building, who has deep knowledge of the community, who brings that deep knowledge into the way we think about our work. Those are all kind of examples of how diversity of knowledge, understanding, relationships really matter to our long-term thrivability. And you can't access this diversity if you are, if you don't have a culture that invites differences to show up and different perspectives. So in a complex system, everybody sits in a slightly different place, and their viewing point starts from that place that they sit in the system. And so we can only understand the system if we have a culture that brings those different perspectives into relationship to each other. That's how we begin to see the whole. Is this making any sense? So here's another kind of beautiful visual on how diversity and critical redundancy work in community foundations. So, you know, we have what we see, the seen and unseen. You know, we see the assets, we see the outcomes, maybe we see the growth that we have, the success, the beauty of our system, but underneath that, we have all these different root structures. We have surface roots and mid-sized roots and deeper roots. This is kind of how prairies are designed. So in a monoculture, we have a lot of corn and soybeans, 5 minutes bike ride from my house. And when there's a big deluge of rain, it packs down the surface roots, eventually get saturated, and after about a half an inch, they can no longer absorb that, and so it just pounds down, and then there's runoff. And so all of that moisture resource gets lost. In a monoculture, in a prairie, it's designed to capture every single resource that drops on it. That's the beauty of the prairie. It has deeper root systems and mid-sized root systems, and when the surface roots get saturated, the mid-sized roots draw that down. And then when they get saturated, the deeper root systems, and during drought, it reverses, going back up. So it's a beautiful design for resiliency. And I think in our community foundations, things like social capital and other kinds of things, those are part of our root structure. And so how do we nourish those? How do we pay attention to those? How do we measure those? Because most of our KPIs don't measure things that are unseen. Tiny little issue here when you're thinking in a resilient frame. So let's go to the next. So connectivity. Great. I don't know what's, this isn't working. So resilient systems are connected. They're fundamentally interdependent. And so we, in our organizations who like to foster silos, and it's stubborn, you know, because our silos tend to be stubbornly reinforced in our organizations. They don't really respect or help you understand the deep connectivity of your system, the deep interdependence. So if we were going to try to design or govern an organization based in connectivity, we would be asking questions like, okay, where are we connected and what's connected to each other and how do we foster that? So I worked with an organization who was deeply siloed, and they were trying to become an integrated organization that helped them become more integrated in the way they worked. And one of the ways they were siloed was the backroom office stuff like finance and HR and fundraising and technology were always seen as second-class citizens in the organization against the ones that really brought in the money or did the programmatic work or whatever. And so we did an experiment and changed the organizational chart from a traditional pyramid to a tree. So we put the leadership group in the root system of the tree. We put all of the infrastructure folks in the trunk of the tree because they facilitate the flow of resources from the canopy down to the root structure and from the root structure up to the canopy. And we put all of the frontline programmatic work in the canopy and the branches. And the simple thing that it did, this is an example of a simple thing to help you see connectivity, is that it helped people see how they were connected to finance as opposed to, why do we need finance anyway? They just take money out of our budget. So it was a visual way to redesign the organizational chart to emphasize connectivity rather than separateness. In a forest floor, if you were walking along and you just paused for a minute and put your foot down, underneath your foot would be a network of mycelium, which is a fungi, that would cover about 300 miles. And so in a forest ecology, there's this connectivity called mycelium that informs, connects, and transfers nutrients totally unseen below the surface of the forest floor. And sometimes I think community foundations, when they're at their very best, can be like mycelium in a forest floor. We connect, we help exchange resources, we inform, and we bring the soil, the roots of the soil, back up into relationship to each other. That's our social capital. So if we were paying attention to connectivity, we might want to, as a board, have some consciousness about what are all of the connections that we should be paying attention to. I went to a session yesterday on journalism and community. It was quite good, but it helped us reveal the connectivity of having a local newspaper and having a stronger sense of community. That's a connection that before yesterday, I hadn't really processed. And so what other kind of critical connections aren't we paying attention to? Those would be questions that I would have. The quality of our relationships in a system that has connectivity matters. So a lot of our training is the task and the accomplishment of the task matters more than the relationship. So if you break a few relationship eggs on the way to getting accomplished, that might be an okay trade-off. But in a system that's built in interdependence, like our communities, our relationships matter. I used to supervise a guy who was very good at the technical parts of his job, but about once every 2 weeks, he would really irritate people in the relational end of things. And I, as his supervisor, would have to go in and do some cleanup on the relational work because it was tough to have people angry at you because you weren't paying attention to them as human beings. And that eventually, over time, got me to realize that we have relational competence as well as technical competence, as well as strategic and other kinds of things that we want to build inside of our staff and inside of the way we work. And sometimes our structures and processes don't actually invite us to see the connectivity. So are there ways to help us see the connection between our budget and our outcomes? And also see what's unseen, that maybe there's something that we're not connecting that's creating a limit on what we can achieve and impact. You can go next. So this is one of my favorite characteristics of resilient systems. Slow variables, probably because I like slow variables in organizations, but the simple metaphor is the quality of the soil over time will affect the quality of your harvest. And if you don't pay attention to maintaining the quality of your soil, eventually your harvest will collapse. So this, in resilient systems, they're always paying attention to what takes time to create and build not just what you can get in an annual harvest. So when we are in a kind of like a COVID, post-COVID crisis, I've noticed that some of the nonprofits that I work with have stopped paying attention to slow variables. Their people, the culture, the capacity building, they're trying to get through their list of things that they've got put down for what they have to check off for the day. And so they're working really hard. There's a lot of activity there. But the deeper work, which is how do you help them rejuvenate themselves, hang in there for the long run, so endurance is a different kind of skill base than winning the race. So when you're in an endurance game, you basically are thinking, okay, how long can you last? How long can you stay in the race? And so what are we not paying attention to? Do we even know what our slow variables are organizationally? So as a governance frame, I'm looking at culture, I'm looking at talent, I'm looking at how we think and our mindsets. I'm thinking about how do we develop. What would take a long time to replace if a person retires and they take their knowledge and their relationships with them. And we should be having not only critical redundancy there, but we should be developing these kind of slow variables in our organization. Let's go to the next. So this is something that I ran into recently called on vertical versus the difference between vertical and horizontal development. Again, as a staff member, I was primarily worried about increasing knowledge and capacity in my staff. But now, in the world that we're living in, the way we think, which is a vertical development, becomes really critical. So connectivity, critical redundancy, those are shifting the way we think. So that's a vertical swing. It's not a horizontal. We need both and to protect the organization's ability to thrive into the future. This next one, this is not only labeled complex, but it invites us into complexity. And we live in a society where we like to actually break complexity down into parts and that we can easily measure or fix or predict or can control. But in actuality, we're living in a world that's highly complex, and we need to up our game in a vertical development way to understand and be able to think in these complex ways. So, so I have some organizations that are experimenting with intentionally trying to build this complex thinking ability in their staff. And one of the ways they're doing it is they're layering on learning from different perspectives. So with this international development group, one of the things they do is they spend money to bring their regional leadership and country leadership together for a week, twice a year. And if you're focused only on task, you might say, that's a big investment, expenditure. Maybe we should just do it on Zoom. But that's not what they choose to do. They choose to do this in person. And they have a structure for the 5 or 6 days that they're there together. And the third day is looking at something that got messed up in the last 6 months and do a deep learning dive on it. And they, in this particular, I was with them a couple of weeks ago, and they were looking at it through the lens of a project management. So what went wrong in this project that we were responsible to do? And what was interesting is that this gave them a lens through which to see it. But I'd also been talking to them about these characteristics of resilience, and one of the people in the room said, but if we look at this from critical redundancy or from diversity based in positional, where people are sitting in the system, they looked at the same problem and they said, all of the people facilitating the work in community had insights and knew this problem, this project was a problem in the very start of the design. So that knowledge was already in the system, but they weren't listening to them, and they weren't inviting them to share what they saw. And so this is an example of how learning and diversity and redundancy and where does the knowledge sit and who can tell us how to do things best. Every time they layered on a different perspective, they got a more complex understanding of the system. So reflection helps us. And I had a friend of mine who was trained as a marine biologist, and I don't know if you've noticed, but fish don't usually hang out and rest at night. Everybody's moving in an ocean ecology. And so he was taught as a marine biologist to pay attention to flow, synergistic connections, relationships, momentum, speed. So he was looking at patterns. That's what he had been taught in order to understand the ocean ecology. And maybe we should be thinking the same thing. Maybe we should be looking at our synergistic connections. So let me give you a few more examples of this. So if you, can you go forward? Let's skip this one. So there's this complicated and complex framework called this Cynefin framework that talks about simple, complicated, complex, and chaotic. Complicated and simple respond with good practice or best practice, but they're closed systems. So basically, the way you can understand what's going on is you analyze, you figure out what the problem is, and you respond. But most of our disruptions are coming from external factors in our environment, which moves us from complicated to complex. And when we move to this little barrier in between, we move from a closed system to an open system where there's new things happening in every 24-hour news cycle that we have to pay attention to, and we can't always figure out what matters and what doesn't. So we have to think differently. This is another vertical framework here. And one of the ways you think differently in order to understand an open system is you have to go up to the balcony and look over on the dance floor to see the patterns of the dance. So how often do we go up versus down when we try to solve organizational problems? So if you go to this slide, this is complicated over here. We have them all lined up. We know all of the factors in the sandbox. The little kid is looking at all of this nicely ordered stuff. But this story over here is complex. There is a narrative here. There is a pattern, but can we see the pattern, right? The pattern is interactive between the kid in the sandbox, and all the possible toys in the sandbox, right? Is this about attention span? Is that part of the narrative? Is this about curiosity? Did he go to one place and discover certain things which then got him to move to another place? So this is the difference. And as a community foundation, working in community, filled with human beings who have minds of their own, right? We're in complex and chaotic business. We're not necessarily, we have elements that are complicated, but we're not really in the complicated space. So if you go to the next slide, do we see the beauty of our community in this deeply connected pine branch? Or do we like to separate all the little pine branches from their primary branch and line them all up, count them, et cetera, et cetera? This is the difference in our highest and best work and things that approximate good work. So our highest and best work always looks at the whole, the soul, the wholeness, the connectivity, the relationships, the future, as well as the present and past. So we connect on all kinds of levels. but we try to see the whole. That's how complexity is understood, is by viewing the whole, not the parts. Because as soon as you strip all the little pine needles off the branches, you've stripped the soul and the beauty out of the branch, right? So this is another vertical thing. We have to kind of figure out, okay, how are we looking at complexity? Do we see it as a friend or an enemy? If we see it as an enemy, then we're trying to break it all down into something that's knowable. If we see it as a friend, we can dance with it, and it can be much more fun. Okay, thank you. So learning, I already talked about this learning, layered learning. A learning-rich environment, again, if you look at our investment portfolios and the people who are managing them, they're paying attention to, they're scanning the environment, they're paying attention to things that might show up. They're trying to figure out, okay, how do we create enough diversity in our portfolio to manage the winds of change or disruption that might be coming our way. And so learning and resilience go hand in hand. Again, if we're focused on trying to get the work out the door, there's not much space to pause and try to figure out what's really going on here. So how do we balance that? How do we balance that as board members? How do we balance that as staff members? Keep going. So hierarchies, tightly held hierarchies, basically dampen down participation. In nature, a species that's apathetic basically doesn't last into the next generation. So basically, to be in nature, you have to be actively participating in your life in relationship to your ecosystem. In organizations, when you have these cultures, again, this is a slow variable, that invite and acknowledge and listen to people who see what's going on very differently than you do from where you sit, you get a more integrated pine needle vision of the organization. Not pine needle, but pine branch view of the organization. You make better decisions as a result, because you're not ignoring something that's completely in front of you but you don't see, because that's not where you sit, right? So once you developing these kind of participatory kind of frameworks is a measure. It's a more complex measure of the quality and health of your organization. So if you don't have a lot of people who are pushing back and the chaos and craziness of discussions that sometimes create tensions between people, you probably aren't creating this kind of high level of participatory structure that is very characteristic of resilient systems. And finally, polycentric, which is a garbage kind of jargony word, but it basically says if you have a very tightly held hierarchy, the person at the top is supposed to know everything, direct everything, see everything, and if that person gets run over by a bus, then your whole organization has no resilience. It's a fragile system because all of that knowledge, strategic direction, et cetera, has been diminished by one kind of freak accident that happens. So resilient systems always have multiple pockets of leadership. So if one goes away, there's another that can come up. This is the idea of the food web. This is another kind of framework of diversity, of deep diversity rather than surface diversity, which is then in that diversity of frameworks, you're trying to create more leaderful. Now, in governance, the Carver model was really big in the 80s and still practiced today in some organizations. And the idea between the board and the executive or CEO was that we only deal with one person in the organization, and that's the CEO or the executive director. And everything else is, That's the only relationship. And we've had stories of foundations that have collapsed using this model of governance because the only relationship you have is through one person. And if that person betrays the trust or the donor intent of the organization, then your whole organization has a huge repair and reputational repair that you have to do, as well as probably programmatic. So this would suggest that governance is better when we have multiple connections to people in the organization instead of one single food chain connection to people in the organization. And we should be asking the question of where are the critical redundancies of knowledge and relationship building that exist in our organization, so we know that there are multiple ways for the organization to sustain itself and continue to do good work if there are retirements or people leave or some other reason. So this is kind of the last of the frame. And again, we tend to, organizationally, our traditional organization is that the person at the top gets the credit, gets the blame. And all of the other work that is done by all of these extraordinary people in our organizations is not really acknowledged, celebrated, and understood. That's kind of not paying attention to the connectivity in the organization of who is doing the work and contributing to our ability to meet mission. Okay, so let's stop there and open it up for thoughts, connections, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
I like the way you put together the soil, and that's the main thing we have to look at, is protecting the soil.
Yes.
And how that affects our whole thing, just like our environment. If we don't look at our environment and only look at the crop for 1 year, we're going to die.
You got it.
Okay, so the other one is interesting, the sandbox. Okay, put that all together, and you lined up the tools, and you lined up the toys, and you lined up the trucks. Okay, I would have gone one level further. I would have lined up the same way, but then I'd probably look at the colors. And I'd have
nice.
the colors on
Yes.
one level,
Yes.
and then go and like all the toys lined up, and first, and then divide it by the color. So you keep on dividing down until you absolutely understand the whole flow.
Right.
But you had to see the whole thing from above before you could do any of that.
So this is kind of the way we try to reclaim our sanity when we're in a highly chaotic or complex place, is we try to go down and understand and know more. The vertical development that I think we have to engage in is that we have to begin to see that our, in complex places, certain things are unknowable. So, you know, what's going on? Are we able to invite the unknown into our lives? Are we able to tolerate the unknown in our lives? I mean, sometimes the unknown drives me nuts because I want to know. But so this categorizing is a deeply experienced and a deeply embedded habit of ours. And we have to begin to have clarity about when does it help and when does it not help. Certain things are knowable in our system, and they're knowable through this kind of really good data analysis, for example. This getting the toys in the sandbox all lined up by color and function and whatnot. But other things in a community is unknowable. And how do we embrace that of what's not known, and even things that are unknowable and because they haven't appeared yet. And so it's one of the questions I ask these days is, don't believe everything you think. That's a little Post-it note on my computer to help me ask the question whether I am thinking in old ways or thinking that might match the resilience frames that I'm trying to work on. And the other is what do I think I know that no longer serves me, which is another kind of learning predisposition to help me be humble about what I know. Brian.
So Kathy, I love your promote polycentric governance systems, but I do have a little question. So whether we're dealing with board members or we're dealing with staff, we're dealing with this little odd thing called humans, who sometimes can be mischievous, sometimes can be evil, sometimes, you know, weird, whatever. And so how do you manage that? Because, I mean, when you're just dealing with the leader, that's bad, but board members can go too deep. I mean, that's something that can be a problem. Or staff members could be self-serving and creating chaos too. So how do you prepare an organization to do this?
I think the deeper question that you might be asking, Brian, is how do we build forms of coherence and cohesion in our organizations around values and mission and culture and purpose, so that the people who are self-serving or who are malicious and engaging in malicious compliance are somehow or other that behavior is either curbed or it's recognized and the person says you have a better fit somewhere else but not here. And values, culture, those are great forms of cohesion but also really looking at your feedback processes so that people who are acting against the core of what you're trying to do are recognized sooner rather than later. Don't do as much deep damage before they are invited to go find a better fit. And often tightly held hierarchies are not good at feedback. And so loosely held hierarchies or systems that are designed and resilient, that feedback on who's aligned and focused on what you're trying to do together and who isn't it just is faster in terms of that loop. I remember having a conversation with you about going to Denver, I think, to the shoe company. What was the shoe company that you went?
Zappos.
Zappos. And there was this feedback loop, very fit, around fit. And they had a conversation, I think you said after a month, and to see whether they still wanted to be there. And they were slow to hire and fast to move people out that didn't have fit. But I also wanted to go back to what is our community, our soil? And if our community is our soil, it's the slow variable. And our community foundation's uniquely positioned to nurture and develop in the soil of our organizations or our communities. I think we have one.
In a hierarchical or polycentric organization versus a flat organization, a couple of questions. Is one inherently more resilient than the other, or can either be designed to be resilient?
Most of our organizations are going to have some kind of both and most of our organizations already have a network culture and a hierarchical culture that are living side by side in them. It's just we don't always recognize that we have a network working on some things and a hierarchy working on others. So neither are inherently bad, but a tightly held, concentrate everything at the top, that is both brittle and fragile. And as community foundations, I just think our mandate is bigger, and we have to look at how our design might actually be hindering the things that we most aspire to be. Thank you. It was lovely. I appreciate it.